Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. As the Summer Olympics in Tokyo loom, what better time to examine the state of the Canada-Japan trade and economic relationship? Japan is Canada's fourth largest trading partner, worth over $30 billion in two-way trade. Fortunately, our guest has been an expert in Canada-Japan for decades. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Charles McMillian to the program. He's professor of strategic management and international business at York University's Schulich School of Business. Welcome, Charlie.
Great to see you. Thank you.
I guess the first question is let our audience know your take on the Canada-Japan trade relationship.
Well, I view relationship between Canada and any other country, including the United States or Britain or France or Europe in general, as a process. It's an ongoing thing. The relationship is much deeper than it was, say, 30 years ago, involving more than economic issues. We've got links, with universities, with artistic organizations, with cities, but it can be improved. Most people don't realize that Japan is one of the technological superpowers, and we are very weak in innovation. And I think that is a link that we should be fostering far more than we are, and extending to a lot of other areas, including professional schools like engineering, medicine, and even architecture.
Yeah, so I think you raise a very good point that it's not just up to the manufacturing communities, let's say, to develop those strategic and trade relationships, but really we need a kind of a whole of society approach if things are going to move forward. Is that your point of view?
Well, give you two examples of that. Japan has no raw materials or resources or whatever, so it lives off its wits, its intellectual capital, its brains, its people. And so we are a big exporter of commodities, farm products or whatever. And there's massive changes going on just in farming, plant-based products, etc. And Japan is becoming a leader. We have to accelerate our linkages in just that one area. Or to take Ontario, as you know, the Mulroney government was up to its eyeballs, frankly, in the auto industry, getting Toyota and Honda, Suzuki to invest in Ontario. But the global auto industry, including electronic cars, battery cars, or whatever, this is an area where Japan is a leader. And we just have to be involved. And frankly, if we rely on Detroit, which has been kind of the Ontario model in the past with Ford and General Motors, Ford is in more trouble than I think most people realize. General Motors it's changed dramatically, but it went bankrupt. But these new technologies, including battery technologies, semiconductors and all that, we just have to be involved because it's so central to the Ontario economy. I use that as only one example.
Sure. No, I think case in point. So let me ask this then. I think you basically made this point that Japan sometimes is an afterthought. A lot of attention in Canada, policymakers and so on, in China, USA. So build the counter argument to that, why Japan is so and should be so important to us. As you've said, for technology, does it go further than that?
Well, I understand those arguments. First of all, for a lot of Canadians, Asia is a new thing. They're not really Asian experts. We have traditionally, in government, in the private sector, been Atlantic, which means Europe, particularly Britain and France, Germany to some degree, and the United States. So Asia is a new thing. Japan was the natural platform to focus on Asia, which includes China.
Right.
Some people mistakenly almost wanted to bypass Japan and go directly to China. And that was a mistake. China has its own game, political, economic, technological, or whatever. I'll give you a specific example.
I'm gonna
Canadian Pacific.
cut you off just there because we
Sure.
are going to go to a commercial break. This is a very
Okay, sure.
important point, so we're going to hop right back in on your example. Please stay with us. We'll be right back with Dr. Charlie McMillian. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Charles McMillian. He is Professor of Strategic Management and International Business at York University. Talking about Canada-Japan, love to get back on to what you were saying just before the break about some of the examples of how this relationship should be managed better.
Well, to give you a specific example, I could give two, Nortel, where they got huge contracts but couldn't deliver with the quality standards required in Japan. But the other is Canadian Pacific. Management of Canadian Pacific has taken the Pacific out of the word. And Canadian Pacific has a long history in Asia, not only with sailing ships and whatever, not only with Hong Kong, Japan, and even India. But for all intents and purposes, the Pacific has been taken out of Canadian Pacific. That's an example of huge mistakes and a lack of an understanding of how slowly, over the last 30 years, and I'm not blaming anybody in particular, slowly, we have to have a global mindset. A lot of our companies, don't forget, take Bombardier, its main competitor came from Brazil. Sudbury, nickel, its main competitor was Russia. So sometimes your competition comes from unlikely sources, and we do live in a global world, so we need people in the private sector, business associations, unions, universities, the public service, to focus on the global mindset and then zero in on particular countries for particular reasons.
How would you describe, we've been talking about some of the challenges, and fair enough. What are Canada's strengths that should be put to better use, perhaps, when it comes to these trade relationships?
Well, you've traveled a lot, and you were in government all. One thing and I've traveled more than most people, the one huge strength of Canada is the Canada brand. We are seeing in the most diverse places in Central Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in China, in Russia, for our values, our multicultural outlook. We're a bilingual country. They just look at Canada, and more importantly, Canada is something that the British aren't, or the French aren't, or the Americans aren't. Whether it's their past, the history, colonial, or whatever you want to call it. And a lot of countries look at Canada as a voice to do certain things. And in these complicated issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's energy policy, food production today, Canada has a voice, part of the G7 or whatever, but close linkages with certain countries that other countries are trying to get involved with. Right. And that's why I think the Canada brand is something we're not exploiting. The word soft power is a buzzword to describe that. But that is a really important fact. I understand hard power and economic and military, being the predominant things. But soft power is another factor as well. And that's where young people in sports and the Olympics and these kinds of issues create and extend soft power. And to be honest about it, the British and the French are very good at this.
Yes. This comes back to the Olympics a little bit because I've known when I was in government how Canada always had a business strategy at each Olympics that was not on our soil, even on our soil, I guess at the Vancouver Olympics, as a way to also advance our business interests, again, using that soft power. Do you see that happening in Tokyo at all?
Well, the Tokyo Olympics, there are three problems with the current Olympics. COVID being the obvious one. Second, it was postponed. And third, it's been very controversial within the country because Japan has been slow to bring out the vaccine rollout. Less than half of Japanese have the vaccine that Canada has. And we were slow, and I'm not blaming anybody of that. It was a supply problem, not a demand problem. But we're vaccinating people, and we don't have these scares that are taking place in the U.S. or whatever. I'm much more optimistic about the Olympics. But the Olympics in Japan, first of all, I've never been to a country where everybody's a sports nut. Lots of people love, say in Canada, ice hockey, but don't know much about a lot of other sports. The Americans like basketball, football, or whatever, but not so good in cricket or sumo wrestling or ice hockey. They are just crazy about sports.
Hold that thought, Charlie. We do have to take another break. I apologize.
Okay, sure.
Important point, so we will get right back to it after the break. Please stay with us.
No problem.
And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Charles McMillian. He is professor of strategic management and international business at York University Schulich School of Business, talking about Canada, Japan, and Canada and trade more generally. Please continue with your point about the Olympics and Canada's potential opportunities there.
Well, the Olympics, is a big issue in Japan because in 1964, when they hosted the Olympics, it was a tool to bring a new Japan, to expose all of these companies that nobody had ever heard of, whether it was called Sony or Toyota or Honda or whatever, to the international world. And Japan is going through a lot of internal changes, demographics, et cetera. It's an aging society. And they wanted to expose a lot of new technologies and new ideas, as an Asian country, as a leader or whatever, which of course is opportunity for other countries, wanting to sell their goods and services in the same way. Unfortunately, it was postponed.
Right.
Japan, or like Tokyo, is like Paris or France. All of the facilities are basically available and have been there for some time for winter and summer sports. So Japan isn't faced with the massive expenditure that inflicts poor countries. And you remember the Sochi Olympics in Russia cost them $50 billion. It's scandalous.
Yeah.
And as you know, in Brazil, $15 billion, and they built the Olympic facilities, and they're sitting idle. So you don't have that problem in Japan. But the criticism within Japan is that the government has been slow to get the supply of the vaccine. Now, they're racing like crazy. They're already up 25% from zero. There's controversy in Japan about certain events being open, or closed, like swimming events inside a pool, where a lot of events are in open air, so it's less risky, whatever. But my own view is that they'll pull off the Olympics in typical Japanese style, and I think a lot of the criticism will fade away after it opens.
So I would love to broaden this out a little bit and talk about the interplay of China, Japan, Canada. You mentioned that a little bit earlier, that Japan should have been seen as a door to the wider Asian market. Canada is a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Tell us a little bit more about that interplay and what it means for, obviously we have a very difficult political and economic relationship with China right now. There's emerging economies like Vietnam and so on. Give us your sense of that vis-a-vis Canada, Japan, but also the broader picture.
Well, you see, that's good, and TPP is a really good example. We were behind the eight ball because TPP was an American initiative, and stupidly on the part of the Americans, and I've written a new book on that to talk about that, which excluded Japan and Canada. Then when Japan finally get in, and the real supporters of TPP, other than the Americans, were Australia and New Zealand. And Australia saw Canada as a competitor, so they didn't want direct competition or whatever. But then when it get time for the countries to vote Japan as part of the TPP negotiation, Canada was the last to support them. And what I'm really getting about TPP was taken over by Prime Minister Abe as a central feature of his third arrow. And he met all the leaders and all that. And it was never going to pass Congress. It's easy to blame Trump, who's been a terrible person on trade issues, was never going to pass Congress, including by the Democrats. The reality was that opened a further door for Canada to support Japan in dealing with these other Asian countries. And you mentioned one, Vietnam. Vietnam is one of these it's a communist country, but entrepreneurial countries like you wouldn't believe, with new startups, with links, potential links to Canada. There are only 3 big companies, Canadian companies, involved in Vietnam when I was there the last time. There 5 times. Manulife, SNC, Air Canada was negotiating, and the third slips my mind, but that's the problem. We just have to be engaged, and that's where alliances, and I think companies in these different countries can work together, because foreign offices is expensive,
Right.
but I think we can do a much more creative job in moving into these countries through alliances.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Charles McMillian of York University, professor of strategic management and international business, talking about Canada, Japan, Canada, Asia. Love to continue this conversation about Japan's growing strategic reach. I'm thinking of the Quad as the prime example of that, to check China's aggressive stances. And so what's the interplay of that reality, I think, on the ground, and how Canada, again, has an opportunity to be, somewhat more important for China relations, Japanese relations?
Well, and because you see, part of the problem is that for a lot of Asians, they don't see Canada as an Asian country.
Yeah.
And because we haven't been engaged enough. To use an example, and it's a bad one, but we opened 4 offices in Japan outside Tokyo, and one in Osaka, Nagoya, the home of the car industry, and we closed it. We just have to be engaged. Private companies have to be more engaged. Japan has a strategic link with the United States, the nuclear umbrella, but the Quad is only one example of Japanese, and TPP is another, Japanese initiative to position themselves within Asia, keeping their eye on China, including extending their defense forces to the South China Sea. And the good news is that the Americans are waking up to the Asia threat from China, and we have to be engaged in that. Another specific example that affects Asia, but in our backyard, is the Arctic. Lots of Asian countries, including China, are looking at the Arctic as a gateway, as the shortest distance from China to Europe. And that will have military connotations. We just have to devote time and resources, and time is a big problem for politicians and the bureaucracy, but we just have to devote these to these kinds of issues, because the world is changing. And I'm just amazed at how much Japan and China know about the Arctic.
Yeah. No, they've been attending Arctic meetings for a good long while now, asserting sort of a strategic interest. So I guess my last question to you then would be this, and you've partially answered it talking about offices and so on, but how can we make Canada more relevant as an Asian country? Because I think that is an important aspiration for Canada, to be seen as an Asian country as well as an Atlantic country.
Well, the good news is, a lot of young people are visiting Asia, visiting Japan, which is less true of the older people. And unfortunately, a lot of senior executives fly to Japan first class, stay in a fancy hotel, have a bunch of meetings, and fly home and think they know Japan. I talked to somebody like that yesterday. You just have to, and the auto industry is a perfect example. We just have to have regular engagement. see, these countries have executives at different industries and in government as well, not only educated in foreign countries, working in foreign companies, and then working for a foreign company in their home country. And France is fantastic that way. We just have to have more of that. And that's where I think, the universities have to be much more engaged in Asia in general and Japan in particular. To use a specific example, one of my favorite Canadian companies, or two of them, both from Quebec, Saputo in dairy, they're moving into Asia and China through Australia, through an acquisition in Australia. Manulife and Sun Life, and particularly Sun Life in India, are really engaged in Japan, Korea, and China, as well as Vietnam and India. And they place senior executives on regular visits to these areas.
I'm sensing we're going to need another show, Charlie, because we're out of time today. This has been fascinating. I really appreciate your devotion to this, and certainly you are educating our audience. So thank you for being our guest today.
Great to be with you. Take care.
Charlie McMillian, always an astute observer, Canada, Japan, Canada, Asia. Lots to say there, probably another show in there somewhere, but thanks for watching this one.